What happened to music soundtracks for movies? It's your man Delvin here, and bruh, what happened to music soundtracks? I mean, at one point in time, a poppin' soundtrack made you want to go check out the movie. I mean, a poppin' soundtrack was better than some albums. But nowadays, we starting to see less and less soundtracks. And that's sad, man, because some of the best music came from soundtracks. And in no particular order, I got 10 of the best soundtracks of all time. First up, I got the biggest selling soundtrack of all time, Whitney Houston's The Bodyguard. Woo! This was the biggest selling album of the 90s. Yes, a soundtrack. The biggest of the 90s. The 90s. One of the golden eras of music. And Whitney Houston had one of the greatest vocal performances of all time. Some people say the greatest of all time. I Will Always Love You. Woo! Nobody could sing like Whitney. And then she also had I'm Every Woman on this project. This album did over 45 million records around the world. The biggest selling female album of all time. Woo! This one right here, history. Now here's one that really gets people. Prince's Purple Rain was actually a soundtrack. Yes, it was his solo album, but it was also a soundtrack to the movie Purple Rain. So this will arguably be the greatest soundtrack of all time. You know what I'm saying? Purple Rain, one of the greatest albums of all time. Prince was on top of the world. If it wasn't for Michael Jackson, Prince would have been the man of the 90s. This album had Party like 1999. It had Purple Rain. It had When Doves Cry. This one is a classic. One of the greatest. Where all my hip-hop heads at? You know about this one. The Above the Rim soundtrack for a lot of people in hip-hop. This is the greatest hip-hop soundtrack of all time. It had one of Tupac's best songs, Pain, on here. And also had a huge hit from Nate Dogg and Warren G, Regulate. This one right here, just classic 90s hip-hop, man. People do not forget this one. In hip-hop, this is a classic. The Queen did it again. Whitney Houston is the queen of soundtracks. Waiting to Exhale soundtrack is a classic. This one might be better than Bodyguard because there was a lot of soul on this one. I love this one. Whitney had a huge hit, Exhale, on this one. Toni Braxton had Let It Flow. Brandy was new at this time and she had Sitting Up in My Room. TLC was on here. Mary J. Blige had Not Gonna Cry. This one is a classic. R&B royalty on this one. Woo! This is another one of them ones. The Space Jam soundtrack, man. This soundtrack is one of the best-selling soundtracks of all time. First of all, you had the huge hit with Seal, Fly Like an Eagle. You had D'Angelo, I Found My Smile Again, on here. I forgot that Monica's For You I Will is on this one. But boy, one of the biggest songs of the 90s. R. Kelly, I Believe I Can Fly. Woo! That was a monstrous hit. One of the songs of the 90s, man. Besides Whitney Houston, I Will Always Love You, probably the biggest soundtrack song of all time. I Believe I Can Fly was everywhere, man. This soundtrack, man. Bugs Bunny even had a song on this soundtrack, man. Classic soundtrack. Next up, we got another hip-hop soundtrack, man. Eminem with 8 Mile soundtrack. One of the greatest hip-hop songs of all time, and probably Eminem's best song of all time, Lose Yourself, is on this project, man. Then we got introduced to 50 Cent on Shady Records on this one with Wankster. One of 50 best songs of all time. Another one that's underrated on this one is Jay-Z and Freeway, 8 Mile and Running. And do not sleep on Macy Gray, Time of My Life on this one. This one, dope project. Let's talk about it. Set It Off soundtrack has one of my favorite songs of all time. In Vogue, What It's Gonna Be. The passion on that song is just out of this world. You feel me? They had Gladys Knight and Shaka Khan on this one. Brandy's on this one. Ray J, a young Ray J was on this. Buster was on this. This soundtrack, that In Vogue song, man, one of my favorite R&B songs of all time. And I got one more for you, man. Rush Hour 1 soundtrack. Woo! Okay, let's talk about this one. You had Jay-Z and Ja Rule with Can I, a straight-up anthem. Then you had Joe and Case, Faded Pictures. That is a R&B classic, man. Woo! Just dope. Then we had one of my favorite R&B songs of all time. Dru Hill, How Deep Is Your Love. Dru Hill was a big deal back then. You feel me? Like, if you understand, you understand. This soundtrack, fire.